Hello again, garden friends. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the pest control methods I use in my garden that don't involve me spraying any pesticides. Organic gardening can mean different things to different people. To some people, it means not using any pesticides or insecticides. Others, it means using approved organic pesticides. I personally am not against the use of organic pesticides, especially insecticides, in certain instances, but I do think they need to be a last resort. They tend to be the first thing that people reach for when they see signs of insect damage in their garden. And it's important to remember that there is not an insecticide out there, this includes organic insecticides, that will not harm or at least deter some beneficial insect in some way. So they need to be used responsibly and, again, as a last resort. I'm not going to talk about organic insecticides in this video, but if you're interested in learning more about organic approved insecticides, let me know down in the comments. Maybe I can do like a part 2 of this video. When you think about your garden, and this includes vegetable gardens, you want to think of it as a very diverse ecosystem with lots of different kinds of plants and lots of different kinds of insects. And this will include insects that we often think of pests, but they are an important part of the food web. But the good news is, in a healthy ecosystem, plants have ways of adapting and protecting themselves from too much pest damage, and there's also other insects that can help control pest populations. It's really, really important to become familiar with the insects you see in your garden. Just because you see an insect on a plant doesn't mean it's an insect that's causing damage. There's a lot of insects outside of bees and butterflies and ladybugs that are beneficial in the garden, ones you may not be familiar with. So things like ground beetles, things like syrphid flies, things like soldier beetles. And if you don't know what these things look like, you may mistake them for something that's causing harm to plants when in fact they're actually a benefit to your garden. It's also important to know how particular bugs cause damage. A lot of times we call everything in the insect world a bug, but a true bug has a piercing, sucking mouth part. So these are things like harlequin bugs, aphids, squash bugs. These insects are not going to cause chewing type damage on leaves. Instead, they're going to cause things like wilted leaves or wilted portions of leaves where they're sucking the juices out of them. So if you see chewing damage on leaves, but then you see aphids, it's not the aphids causing that problem, it's another insect. Insects that cause chewing damage on leaves are going to be things like flea beetles or cucumber beetles or caterpillars like cabbage worms or hornworms. What you want to do in your home garden is have an IPM, and this stands for Integrated Pest Management. This means we're using lots of different methods to not only help control pests, but to protect the beneficial insects in our garden. One of the first things you can do is to really focus on the health of your soil. When you have healthy soil, you have healthier plants, plants that can use their natural defenses against pests. You can help build up healthy soil in your garden by adding things like compost, which has lots of beneficial bacteria and microorganisms. You can practice crop rotation. This means we're not planting things in the same plant family in the same spot year after year. If you have a small garden, which can make crop rotation really difficult, you can follow up heavy feeders like onions or garlic or tomatoes with things like bush beans, anything really in the legume family, and this can help replenish the soil and add nutrients back in. You can also plant cover crops. Cover crops are things that we plant sometimes in the off season or sometimes in between heavy feeders or right before or after our main growing season. And these cover crops can not only help protect the soil when we're not growing plants, but they can add beneficial nutrients and plant matter, organic matter, back into the soil. In a home garden, I recommend growing annual cover crops, or you can plant perennial cover crops that aren't hardy to your winter, so they'll die back over the winter. So this could be things like buckwheat, it could be tillage radish, it could be crimson clover, it could be winter oats or winter rye. I do have a couple short videos on growing cover crops in a home garden. I'll link those below. So after you've focused on building up healthy soil in your garden, the next thing you want to do is plant a variety of plants. We don't want to have nice, pretty rows of all the same plant in our garden. That may look aesthetically pleasing, but if you go into a forest or out into a field, you'll see that nature does things very differently, and that's for a good reason. Because when it comes to plants, diverse diversity is really important. It not only helps protect themselves, it helps protect the soil, and it encourages lots of different insects in our garden. This can be tricky in a home garden though, because you may have certain plants that need to be fertilized a certain way, or you have other plants that can be covered because they don't need to be pollinated, and other plants that need to be uncovered because they need to be pollinated. So mixing everything up can cause some issues. So what do? What I like to do personally is plant a lot of flowers and flowering herbs in between my fruits and vegetables. Some of my favorites are low-growing flowers like dwarf marigolds or dwarf cosmos. I also like alyssum. I really love planting petunias. They're kind of finicky to grow. They need to be watered and fertilized quite a bit, but their leaves are actually pretty sticky, so they're great at trapping things like fungus gnats and adult aphids. Planting herbs and letting them flower in your vegetable garden is one of the best attractions for beneficial insects. So dill, cilantro, basil, oregano, thyme. I know a lot of times we want to keep these pruned, especially if we're using them for cooking, because the flowering can affect the taste. But if you have some extra space, or maybe you can put containers around your raised beds with flowering herbs, this is such a great benefit to your garden. So even if you can't completely mix up everything you grow, you can plant a variety of flowers and flowering herbs between those fruits and vegetables that will really help increase that diversity. And planting a very diverse garden is going to be beneficial in two ways. The first is it's going to attract those beneficial insects. These are insects that are going to help control pest populations. They're going to bring in things like ladybugs, lady beetles, and things like lacewings that help control aphids. They're going to bring in things like parasitoid wasps that help control hornworms. That diversity will help bring in things like praying mantises and spiders, things that eat lots of different kinds of bugs. And a lot of these beneficial insects are also pollinators. So not only are they going to help control pests, but they're going to help increase your harvest of your fruits and vegetables. The other way that having a diverse garden can help with pest control is that a lot of these pests are using chemical sense or visual cues to find their host plants. So when we're mixing up a lot of different plants, it can disrupt these cues. They may have a harder time finding their host plants if those plants are mixed in with lots of other plants. Another method I use for pest control in my garden is through planting trap crops. Now, trap crops are plants that are highly attractive to certain pests. So we're using those plants to sort of lure pests away from other plants. A couple examples would be nasturtium. Nasturtium is highly attractive to leaf miners and to aphids. So I'll plant these a little bit away from plants that those bugs would normally bother. Another trap crop in my garden are ground cherries. Ground cherries are super attractive to flea beetles. So I'll usually plant them at the edges of my beds, and this will help keep flea beetles away from things like potatoes or anything in the brassica family like cabbages, broccoli, or kale. I know Japanese beetles can be a huge problem for a lot of gardeners. I grow raspberries, and those Japanese beetles will almost exclusively stay on those raspberries, which makes it easier for me to treat. But it also protects a lot of other plants, and raspberries are pretty vigorous. They usually don't mind a lot of the damage and will still do really well. I'll still usually get a pretty good harvest. If you're going to use trap crops though, you need to make sure you're planting them a little bit away from the plants that you want to protect. And you also need to make sure that you then treat the trap crops for those insects. So you could do hand picking, or you could use an organic insecticide on those trap crops, because otherwise you're just creating like a buffet for those pests and you're allowing them to reproduce. Another tool I use in my garden, and this is probably one of the most effective, is I use floating row covers. In my garden, if a plant does not need to be pollinated, it gets covered, and this takes care of 90% of the pest issues I have in my garden, and that includes rabbits that love to eat on my young seedlings. All of my young seedlings get covered when they first go in my garden. Again, this helps protect them from rabbits and other critters that like to eat young seedlings, the birds as well. There are some plants, however, that I keep covered the entire time they're growing. These are going to be things like my salad greens, so my lettuce, my spinach, arugula. They're going to be brassicas like kale, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli. I don't usually have a lot of pests that bother my onions or garlic, but if you do, these are plants that could also be covered. Carrots could be covered. Most everything that we're growing in spring and fall can be covered. You can also cover self-pollinating plants. These are things like beans, peppers, tomatoes, peas, they'll do better if they're open and exposed to pollinators. But a lot of times those flowers can be pollinated through movement or just on their own, so they can be covered. Another way I deal with pests in my garden is through hand picking. And I know this isn't a lot of people's favorite, but when you don't have a huge garden, this is a pretty effective method. So I hand pick a lot of insects like squash bugs, cucumber beetles, Japanese beetles. I also do this with harlequin bugs. These pests stand out. They're really easy to see, and hand picking is a very effective method. I love doing this with Japanese beetles because, again, they're congregating on my raspberries. So I'll go out in the early morning or late in the evening when they tend to be less active, and they'll just be hanging out in clumps. And I get a 5-gallon bucket filled with soapy water, and I just take that cane, bend it over the bucket, and shake those Japanese beetles into the bucket. If grabbing insects with your bare hands or even gloved hands really freaks you out, and by the way, that is completely understandable, you can get things like handheld vacuum cleaners that can sort of suck the bugs off the plants. If you struggle with hornworms on your tomatoes, and even though they can get pretty big, they're often difficult to see because they're so well camouflaged. You can go out at night with a black light flashlight and they'll really show up under that black light. It's a great activity to do with kids. And you can either pull them off, or if you don't want to do that, you can clip off the branch that they're on. They're a great snack for chickens or for bearded dragons, or again, you can throw them in a bucket of soapy water. And the last thing I do is just accept that healthy gardens have some pest damage. You'd be surprised how much plants can withstand when they're healthy plants. And I always say, if you want to attract and keep those insects that help control pests in your garden, they need to have a food source. So you're going to need to have some pests. A lot of times if I see pests on a plant, I'll just wait, because a lot of times nature will take care of the problem for me. I do want to say I am not a fan of buying things like ladybugs or praying mantises to release in your garden. I think this is only helpful in situations like greenhouses where those insects couldn't normally come in, but even then you need to be really careful. Inevitably, some of those insects will be harmed during that shipping process, and a lot of times those insects are not native to your area. They're not used to the pests in that area. They're not used to the plants in that area. So this can cause problems. And these insects are very mobile. They're not going to necessarily stay in your garden, especially if you don't have any pests to keep them fed. So rather than buying these insects, spend time and energy planting things that will naturally attract them. So there are some ways that I help control pests in my garden without the use of insecticides. Again, if you want to learn more about organic approved insecticides, then let me know in the comments below. I can do a part 2. As always, don't forget to follow me here and on my other social media channels where I post easy to follow videos aimed at helping beginner gardeners. Until then, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.